Welcome back to Tom's World Scale Model Series. In today's installment, we undertake construction of our recently unboxed Meng Willys MB Jeep. If you enjoy programming on scale modeling, then show your support by subscribing to this channel. Leave us a comment, like, dislike, or share the video with friends. Clicking the notification bell gives you alerts when we post new content. Or visit the channel Tom's World for a friendly visit for a complete list of all our videos. Our unboxing video revealed another quality release from Meng Models. Inside the box we found a beautifully detailed kit with superb modern molding, clear instructions, and a choice of medium or heavy machine guns. Having recently built Meng's beautiful Renault FT17, our expectations for our Jeep project were high. Our video journal covers every aspect from construction, painting, to decaling, and weathering. So stick with us as we transform a pile of plastic parts into a stunning miniature of one of World War II's most iconic vehicles. It's been a few years since I built a scale replica of the Willys Jeep. I have a foggy memory of building the old monogram kit as a kid, and there's an SAS British version sitting unfinished in my stash. It's been a while since I've built an American version, so I was pretty excited about this project. As always, we begin by removing our parts from the sprues. I placed the first cut quite far from the part to avoid stress cracks caused by the pinching action of the cutters. I make my second cut closer to the part, careful to leave a little bit of the sprue gate. Our final cut removes most of the sprue gate, but we're careful not to gouge or cut into the actual part. We use these two-sided sanding sticks to finish. We start with the coarse grit and finish with the fine side. It's especially important to follow the contour of the parts when sanding so we don't damage the part or distort its shape. This is how the part looks with the sprue gate attached, and this is how it should look after processing. We follow this cleanup process for all our parts. The kit has a few delicate parts, and we must be careful when removing them from the sprue tree. It's easy to break these parts when cutting them free, and although we can glue them back together, it can be difficult to hide the cracks. A little care, patience, and sharp blades carry the day. Our engine builds up with 9 parts, and there are all the pieces cleaned up and ready for assembly. Once assembled, the engine looks great. We can take the time to super detail it with spark plug wires and other cables and hoses. We'll build up strictly with the parts in the box so we can assess the kit on its own merits. A dry fit confirms the assembled engine fits perfectly within the frame. Next, we build up the front differential, steering boots, and suspension. Notice the no glue symbols, which allows us to pose the front wheels. The steerable hubs are quite small. If we want our front wheels to swing freely, we have to make sure to place our glue on these surfaces only. Make sure no glue seeps into the little trench. If done properly, the hubs swing freely. The buildup includes a steering stabilizer bar, but it does not connect to the hub boots. In other words, although the wheels can be steered, they'll swing freely, independent of each other. Admittedly, this is quite an odd arrangement, and builders may consider gluing these hubs in place rather than have them flop around freely. The muffler is not slide molded, so the exhaust pipe is solid. It's pretty obvious on the finished model, so we should hollow out the end. To hollow out the end, we use a pin vise and a bit with a diameter that's just smaller than the pipe. And here's the finished look. This little detail definitely makes the part look more realistic. I also stippled on some Mr. Surfacer 500 to give the muffler a rough texture reminiscent of heavily rusted and flaked metal. Once painted, it should look pretty realistic. We have to drill a few holes in the body. There are many depressions on the underbody, so we don't want to drill holes in the wrong places. These are the holes we need to drill out with a 1mm bit. If in doubt, follow the instruction booklet carefully to avoid having to fill holes drilled by mistake. The inside of the rear gate has 2 knockout depressions. To our relief, a dry fit of the part shows that these scars are hidden, so no filling is required here. On the outside of the rear gate there are holes that need filling, and the instructions point these out. The holes are likely a leftover from the Meng flamethrower version of the kit. The holes are too large to fix with just fillers, so I press short lengths of dimensional styrene into the holes. These are glued in place. We can now finish with a little Mr. Surfacer putty. And here's the finished look. After painting, these holes will totally disappear. Follow the instructions carefully since some of these holes must remain open as mounting points for parts will attach later. Our wheels build up using 2 parts, which has the potential to leave a noticeable seam along the circumference. Here's how we get around having to use filler. To glue the wheel halves together, I'll use this heavier bodied glue. In this case it's a Tester's brand, but other manufacturers make similar thicker bodied model glues. The key is to use a heavy application of glue. You can smear it on with a toothpick or carefully apply it straight out of the bottle. Be careful of applying straight out of the bottle as the glue can ooze out uncontrollably. We're generous with the amount of glue we apply, putting far more on than we normally would. We then press the 2 halves together tightly. Here I'm using 4 finger clamps to apply a lot of pressure to the parts. By using a generous amount of glue and tightly pressing the pieces together, we get this little bead of melted plastic along the seam. This is exactly what we're looking for. Just make sure that the bead runs along the entire circumference. We have to make sure the bead is completely dry, maybe after about 2 or 3 hours, then we can sand it. Jumping ahead a little, once painted we can see that the seam is totally gone and we didn't have to use any filler. If only every seam and pin scar was this easy. There are also 2 push pin depressions on the back of the rear bench rest. They're hard to see on the video, but they're definitely there. Luckily these are very shallow and we can simply shave the surface down with our number 16 X-Acto blade. The back of the seats also have push pin depressions that need filling. If you watched our Tamiya Kugelwagen build, we encountered similar scars on those seats as well. We'll use the same technique that we used on our Kubel build to clean up the scars on our Meng seats. X-Acto produces a number of shaped blades for their knives. This is a small collection that I keep in my drawer. We'll use this number 16 blade to get started on our seats. I begin by scraping down the cross members. We then go in with a sanding stick to smooth the surface as much as possible. Mr. Surfacer 500 is my go-to filler for pushpin depressions, but I was looking for something a little thicker, so I decided to try this Mr. Dissolve Putty. This product is also lacquer based and we can apply it with a brush. These filler products tend to shrink and level. Here's the effect after about 30 minutes of drying. It took 3 thick applications to fully fill the hole, and after about 2 hours of drying, we can sand the surface. Once painted, the blemish will totally disappear. Unfortunately, I saw no advantage of this product over the Mr. Surfacer 500. Both are very similar, so either will work for filling these types of blemishes. To replace the cross members that run across the back of the seats, I'll use stretched sprue. You can use dimensional styrene rod if you have some on hand, but stretching sprue is an inexpensive alternative. We simply heat the sprue over flame, then once softened, we can stretch it. Unfortunately, stretched sprue is not dimensionally uniform. We can see that the edges of the run tend to be thicker. We just have to inspect the piece until we find a length with fairly uniform thickness. Every kit has an abundance of excess sprue tree material, and since it's easy to make, we just keep stretching until we get enough uniform pieces. Then it's just a matter of test fitting and trimming the lengths to fit. We then glue our pieces on. Here I'm holding them in place with finger clamps until they dry. And here's the finished look. With all our parts cleaned up, we're ready for painting. As always, I'll start with my flat black enamel base coat. I use Tester's Model Master products, which I have on hand. I'll chip the floor in the cockpit using the hairspray technique. Over top of the black coat, I'll spray this Alclad 2 lacquer as a base. It's important to use either lacquer or enamel so the water we use for the chipping doesn't dissolve this layer. I spot spray the metal color on the areas that I'll chip. Then we apply our hairspray over top the metal layer. I use this cheap brand of hairspray, nothing special really. Comes in spritzer form, so no need to decant it. I simply pour some into my paint cup and spray it on undiluted with my airbrush. 2 to 3 light coats are all that's needed. Next, we lay down our base coat. For the drab, I'll use Tamiya's XF62, but I'll lighten it with a little XF60 dark yellow. I prefer a dark olive drab color to depict US World War II vehicles, but the Tamiya drab does need a little lightening. We've covered chipping in more detail in other videos, so we won't go into detail here, but this is the finished look we're after. We only want to chip the areas where the rider's feet would wear the paint off. Study the instructions and or dry fit the seats to get the correct location of these worn areas. Other parts we leave black, including the frame, battery, and various engine parts. I've started to spot paint some of the details on the engine parts. I brush paint these details on with enamel paints. Some parts in the kit get a coat of khaki. For this I use Tamiya's XF49 acrylic. The seat cushions and rucksacks get this color. Next, everything gets a coat of clear gloss acrylic. For this project I use Tamiya's XF22 thin with lacquer thinner. This seals in the paint and allows our subsequent oil paint weathering colors to flow properly. Next, we apply our decals. Take your time when positioning the decals to ensure they're properly aligned and oriented. Refer to the instruction manual and double check your work. Crooked decals can really spoil the look of a model. We use decal softener next. This softens the decal to ensure it fully adheres and conforms to the surface it's applied to. We apply 2 or 3 coats, allowing them to dry in between. Then with a cotton swab dipped in softener, we press the decal to remove any trapped air bubbles. Rolling the swab from the middle of the decal to the edges is also a good way to remove any air bubbles that get trapped underneath. The decals are then oversprayed with more gloss clear to seal them in. And with these steps complete, we're ready to begin our weathering. I'll start with a pen wash. I'll mix this with oil paints in a tone that matches this pigment color powder. This is Vallejo's Light Sienna. To achieve this tone, I'll mix yellow ochre, burnt umber, white, and a touch of green. And here's the resulting color as I've mixed it in my paint well. We dilute the paint heavily with mineral spirit so it flows off of our brush through a capillary action. I'll then go around the model and hit all the raised details, crevices, nooks, and crannies to bring out the detail. Once our pin wash is sufficiently dry, we blend the edges with a large soft brush. We use a light tapping motion. We want to feather the edges and remove any tide marks. And here's the finished look. This color works very nicely with our dark olive drab base, and it gives the impression of caked on and dried mud and dirt. It looks very realistic and mimics the way mud adheres to real vehicles in the field. I'll also mix an undiluted tint of our light sienna color and use it to dry brush our black parts, mostly the engine parts and details. This creates highlights and helps to make the details stand out. It also looks quite realistic, just the way dust would settle on real engine parts. We can also use a little metallic paint. In this case, I use Model Master's aluminum enamel. We can dry brush it on certain parts to depict worn metal. I've used the effect on the bottom shield that covers the power distribution linkage. I also used it on the radio cooler fan edges, the edges of the transfer case, and certain parts of the engine block. And here's the engine compartment once all the parts are in place. The level of detail is superb, although if I were to build this model again, I would probably want to super detail the engine. Still, out of the box, the engine looks great. Before we muck up the underside of our chassis, we get a good look at how the power distribution on the Willys is laid out. Here's the 134 cubic inch 2.2 liter inline 4 Willys L134 Go Devil engine. Beneath the shield is the power distribution linkage, and we see two drive shafts. One of the shafts runs to the front differential and one is linked to the rear differential. This permits for all four wheels to be powered, which gives the vehicle its four-wheel drive. Some variants also add a third drive shaft, which can be attached to a power takeoff or winch. These are the dry pigment powders I like to use for military vehicle weathering. We covered weathering with pigment powders in other videos, so a quick overview here, starting with the underside of the body. Using a large soft brush, I'll dab on piles of our light sienna powder. I'm generous with the amount I use, and we build up little piles of the stuff just like real mud would collect on the underside of vehicles. We then sprinkle a little of the dark mud color on. That's followed by a few sprinkles of our light dust color. We always use more than one color since we want a natural, random, and irregular look to our weathering. Once our powders are applied, we flood the area with pigment fixer. You can use a dedicated fixer, but here I'm using plain old isopropyl alcohol. And here's the look once the alcohol is dried. For now, I'm just weathering the underside of the vehicle. And make sure to get into the wheel wells as well, since mud, dirt, and grit would naturally collect in these areas on real vehicles. We weather the sides of the body with our light sienna colored oils. We use a large soft brush with only a tiny amount of paint on it, and with a dabbing motion we create dried mud and dust buildup. Our bristles also create spatters. And here's the finished look. I then mix up a very dark gray color and dry brush it on edges that are subject to wear. This area is where the crew climbs into the vehicle, so the paint surfaces would eventually get worn away. The grab handles are also a good candidate for the dark gray color. Once the dark gray paint is dry, I'll rub the edges with my soft lead pencil. This gives these edges a shine which effectively replicates the look of bare polished metal. To muck up our wheels, we make a fairly thick mixture of sienna pigment powder and alcohol. We then paint this on the surfaces that touch the road. When wet, the mixture is imperceptible. The color dust turns solid once the alcohol dries. Then with a finger or a cotton swab moistened with water, we rub off the pigment from the road touching surfaces. The rest of the pigment remains in the tire's crevices. The sculpting on the accessory parts like these rucksacks is fantastic, and we can paint their highlights and shadows to accentuate the details. The bench and seats get the same treatment. I dry brush the edges with a very dark khaki color, and the highlights are added with a light khaki color. A soft brush is used to blend and feather the edges of the shadows and highlights. Our little Garand rifle that's mounted on the windshield gets wood graining on its stock. We use our lead pencil to achieve the metal color on the barrel tube. Our shovel and axe handles also get the wood graining, and the metal parts are colored using our pencil. We bought this brass metallic paint for our Meng FT117 build, and it's definitely come in handy since. The brass metallic paint is quite thick, so I diluted it with a little mineral spirits to aid its flow. I then carefully painted the cartridges on the 50 caliber ammo box with a fine detail brush. To finish the 50 caliber gun, I rubbed metallic pigment powder over the black enamel base. I then rubbed the raised details with my lead pencil. The finished look is quite realistic. With all our loose parts painted, we can now get them attached to the model. I use CA glue to attach the pieces since model glue can get gummed up when trying to glue painted pieces. With our model complete, we can get a final look at our handiwork. In spite of its drab color and tiny size, the model still has a lot of presence. This is likely because of its incredible level of detail. There's just something about this little runabout that epitomizes the US military and the World War II era. That awesome gun that dominates the vehicle very likely has a lot to do with the image that's created. The Meng Willys Jeep was an interesting, educational, and fun project. The parts fell together effortlessly, and the level of detail is in a class of its own. Because of its many small and delicate parts, this kit is likely not recommended for novice or younger builders. Intermediate and advanced builders will, however, have no problems achieving stunning results. Although no figure is included in the kit and the posable wheels lack any synchronizing linkages, the armament options, instrument decals, and amazing engine detail mitigate these shortcomings. While working on this project, faded childhood memories of building the vintage 70s monogram kit came flooding back. This was definitely a personal and nostalgic journey, which reminded me of a time of innocence, discovery, and wonder. As a result, this little model will definitely get an honored place within my display cabinet. And that'll do it for this episode. Join us again for more unboxings, builds, and product reviews coming up in the very near future, or visit the channel for a list of all our entertaining and educational videos. In the meantime, keep your sights on target, keep building, stay well, and all the best.